All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Colby Dow, and I am the digital archivist at the Florence Lauderdale Public Library. And I'm very happy to be joined by Wanda Lloyd today. Wanda is the author of the book Coming Full Circle, From Jim Crow to Journalism. And today she's going to tell us a bit about the book and about her life. And we're very happy to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to give us a brief overview of the book? Did you just tell us what it's about?
Absolutely. So good afternoon. I'm very happy to speak to a group in Alabama because as many of you may know, I spent about almost 9 years in Montgomery as executive editor of the Montgomery Advertiser. This book, Coming Full Circle, From Jim Crow to Journalism, and this is the book, is a memoir of my life growing up in the Deep South in Savannah, Georgia, and during the years of Jim Crow, where, as many of you know, Jim Crow was a period when African Americans were restricted by law, what we could do, where we could go, how we went, where we went to school, kind of education we got, what we did out in the kinds of neighborhoods we lived in, exactly where we lived in terms of neighborhoods. It even restricted some of the things we did downtown that included eating, not being able to eat in most restaurants. Of course, most people know about separate. I remember the water fountains and the toilets having white only, colored only signs for a bit of my childhood. And it even extended to where we were buried because the cemeteries were segregated. So everything was segregated. And so that had a major impact on my life. Not necessarily a lasting negative impact, but it did have an impact because I grew up in a separate society, in a society where one part of our community was white and one part was Black. Diversity is a whole lot different nowadays because we consider diversity to be so much different in terms of different races, gender, of course, age, geographic, where people are from. But in my day, it was all about Black and white. That was the gist of it. I speak to a lot of young people. I was a college professor after I retired from journalism, and I speak to young people about my life. They ask me my life story, and they encouraged me to write this book because as I was explaining to them where I came from, growing up in Savannah, growing up in the years of Jim Crow, working at 7 daily newspapers across the country, becoming a leader in journalism, I would tell them stories, just individual stories that they would ask me about. And one thing became clear as I was a professor, and that is that young people, in my experience, didn't know what Jim Crow was. They had heard of it, but they weren't quite sure what it was. They didn't know, for example, that it was legal to segregate against us. It's almost like young people in school learned about, and I'm speaking specifically of African-American young people because I worked at an HBCU, historically Black college in Savannah. But it's like they knew about slavery, of course, and they knew a little bit about the period of Reconstruction immediately after slavery. And it's almost like they skipped over Jim Crow in their education and went straight to the civil rights movement. And so this really was an education for them. And so they encouraged me to write this memoir. It was the young people who encouraged me to tell my stories in a book because they thought it could motivate other young people to understand some of our history, because they always say you don't know where you're going until you know where you've been. And so they encouraged me to write these stories and also write the stories of my career. And so that's what I have done in Coming Full Circle, From Jim Crow to Journalism. I have documented in addition to my growing up years, my college years, I've documented the 7 newspapers that I worked for. I always worked as an editor, never as a reporter, which a lot of young people in journalism find surprising because traditionally, most people start as a reporter, but I started as a copy editor and I moved through the ranks of editing to different levels and became executive editor at my last newspaper, which was the Montgomery Advertiser in Alabama. I'm very proud of that. Worked at some of those papers included the Washington Post, which is the paper I worked at the longest, 11 years, and USA Today, where I ascended to become senior editor at USA Today. Excuse me. So this book has 4 main themes. The first is history. And the history part is mostly the Jim Crow part, but it's also about my family. I did not grow up poor. I say in the book, this is not a poor me story. I grew up, I guess, solidly middle class Black. Now, that's not necessarily middle class, but it definitely is in the Black community middle class. My family owned businesses and were educators in Savannah, Georgia. And so the history part is one of the themes. The second theme would be journalism, of course, because that was my career. And I read a lot about that, not just about what I did in journalism, but about the state of journalism as I was ascending through all the different papers and different communities that I lived in. The third would be, I think, diversity, because I became a diversity advocate for media. I was on the board of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. I directed a study on diversity for the National Association of Black Journalists. And I did a lot of training, not just in my own newsrooms, but across the country at other newspapers and in communities, because communities wanted to understand diversity as far as media was concerned. They wanted to understand, what is our role in this, this journey toward diversity? How can we help? And so the newspapers would fly me in and have me actually sit down and talk to people in the community, people who were readers, about diversity. And the fourth theme is leadership, because I became a leader in journalism, not just in newsrooms, but also a leader in several professional organizations and other organizations as well. So those are the four main themes. I took my family on this journey with me. I'm married to Willie Lloyd, who was a Navy veteran. We met, he was almost leaving the Navy when we met. When we got married, he was a veteran already. And so he went on this journey with me, living in all these different states. And our daughter, Shelby, who is now in her late 30s, but was a constant traveler with me on my journey as well. And so you'll hear in the reading that I'm going to do, you'll hear those two names. I called him Lloyd because he was in the military. And when I met him, everybody called everybody by their last name. I don't think I even knew what his first name was for a few weeks or days or something after I met him. And our daughter's name is Shelby. So the story, I thought, because I'm talking to the library in Florence, I wanted to read a story about Alabama. And so this comes from the chapter called The Final Newsroom. It's about the last newsroom where I worked, which was the Montgomery Advertiser. And so I'm going to read that story. I was invited to speak several times in different places in Montgomery. As any city that I've worked in, the editor is always someone who's invited to do speeches and to interact with the community. So this is a story about being invited to speak. And it begins, of all the speeches I made in Montgomery, the one I recall the most was at Dexter Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church. Some of our new Montgomery friends who were members had invited us to worship there as soon as we moved to the city. And I recall thinking that, like a lot of churches in city centers where neighborhoods were displaced by suburban growth, the church must be in decline because the sanctuary was never full on the Sundays when we were invited. So I wasn't too worried about speaking there to what I thought would be a small congregation. The service on Sunday, September 26, 2004, was Women's Leadership Day, and I was asked to share thoughts about my experience with hopes of inspiring women as leaders. The church made it widely known in the community that the new Black female editor of the Montgomery Advertiser would be making her first public speech at Dexter Church. All week long, my face was becoming recognized through stories about my arrival, and people who saw me in the grocery store, at events around town, or even in our building at work said, "I hear you're speaking at Dexter Church. I'm planning to come." Really? When Lloyd and I arrived at the church that Sunday morning, we were led downstairs to the pastor's office. I was invited to sit at an antique wooden desk, and was informed that this was the desk where Dr. King wrote his sermons. It was an overwhelming feeling to think about the sermons and the speeches that came to him sitting in that same space that I was occupying. A few members who arrived at the church early trickled in to offer me good wishes, a drink of water, and a corsage to wear. When we went upstairs to the sanctuary, I wasn't prepared for what I saw as the service began. The church was packed. Every pew was full. I mean, packed with people standing and filling the back wall packed. A multiracial crowd had come to hear me speak. Now I was beginning to understand what someone told me as I was about to leave Nashville, that being editor of Montgomery's capital city newspaper and Black and female was a pretty darn big deal. I began by reading my prepared remarks, but looking out over the crowded sanctuary, I realized that people wanted to know more about me. They were present to celebrate this new face in Montgomery, a face that was female and African American. As I started to feel the emotion of where I had come from and where I was in my career and in my life, I felt the need to change course. Though the crowd was large, the sanctuary suddenly felt small and cozy, like a good place to have a conversation, not a speech. I closed the pages of my prepared speech and announced that I would not be reading what I had written. The emotional significance of that day and that place, the same podium that Dr. King used to preach the gospel of God's love and civil rights, overcame me. I was choking up and I had to get my composure. When I finally began to speak again, the words came strictly from my heart. No notes, no prepared text. I just talked. I told the group about my upbringing in Savannah under the restrictive Jim Crow laws. I shared my passion for journalism, and I gave them an overview of every newspaper and every university where I had worked, why I stayed and why I left each one. I talked about why it was important for newspapers and all media to reflect the communities they served. I talked about what I hoped to accomplish in Montgomery, to use the newspaper to bring the community closer together and to highlight people and organizations that don't normally rise to the level of coverage in a daily newspaper. I told them about my passion for mentoring young people to help them skip over some of the landmarks mines I had encountered. I mentioned Shelby and promised that many of them would get to meet our daughter, and promised and when she visited from college. And I introduced Lloyd, my husband, and told the group how much I hoped they would embrace us as new citizens in the community. By the time I finished and sat down, every person in that church who could stand was on their feet. The applause went on for a minute or two, and I was spent, yet exhilarated, and feeling like I had introduced myself to Montgomery in a good and proper way. I rose again and waved my right hand, a symbol of thanks for the approval. Then, right after I sat down a final time, something weird happened. I recall the image of an elderly woman walking down the center aisle toward the pulpit. She climbed the steps and pressed something wrapped in a piece of paper into my hands. Then she left the sanctuary through a side door. I slipped the folded paper into the folder that held my prepared remarks, not bothering to look at it right away. When we got home, Lloyd asked me about the woman who ascended the steps. I opened my folder and I found a brief letter with a hand-printed blessing for success in Montgomery and a $5 bill. I never saw that woman again, and I don't know why she gave me the money. Was she paying me for speaking? Or was it something to keep me safe in my role as editor of the newspaper? I'll never know. At home, I slipped the letter and the $5 bill into a zippered sandwich bag and put it in a place of safekeeping. I still have that little bag and the same $5 bill. Perhaps the woman's gesture protected me from hurt or danger in Montgomery. We remained in Montgomery for almost 9 years, and every year I continued to meet or run into people who told me, I was at Dexter Church when you spoke. I remember you said this or you said that. I remember how you described your childhood in Savannah. Clearly, that day at Dexter Church was memorable.
Well, thank you very much for reading that segment. That's quite the reception you got there in Montgomery when you first showed up.
Yes.
All right, well, I have a few questions I'd like to ask you, and if anyone else has any as we're going along, feel free to drop them into the chat and I can pick them up along the way. Let's start with your, I guess, earlier life. The book covers growing up in Savannah during Jim Crow, and you mentioned how students you have didn't really understand that. Could you perhaps go into a little bit of detail about that, what it's like, how things were different from you, from other kids that you may have known, other, I guess the racial divide and how that influenced your upbringing?
Absolutely. You know, for a lot of people who get to know Savannah, who don't live in Savannah, one of their first introductions is the book Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, where the author talks about the two societies in Savannah, the white society and the Black society. So I would have to say, in part, answering your question, that I didn't have other friends who were not Black. I didn't know any people who were not Black. And that had a profound effect on me for the rest of my life, especially the early part of my adult years, because I had grown up in a totally Black world. Some of the stories that I tell in the book, I talk about getting this separate education at Beach High School in Savannah, and how all of our teachers were Black, all of our students were Black. We had secondhand furniture that was handed down from the white schools after they finished with it and was pretty beaten up by then. We had books that were used and abused. And by abused, I mean our teachers taught us that we should always respect books. We should never write in books. We should never tear up books. We should never tear pages out of books. But when we got our textbooks, many times the pages were missing. Some of the pages were missing. And so when our teachers would make assignments to us and say, you know, I don't know, read pages 27, 28, 29 or something. If we opened our book and that page was missing, somebody at a white school had torn it out before we got it. And we knew what schools it had been at because students were encouraged to write their name in the school. They would write their school name. So if it said Savannah High School or one of the other few white schools, we knew that that's where they came from. And so we would get on the phone. My friends and I would get on the phone. My classmates would get on the phone. And we would say, I need page 26. Can you read it to me? And we would read it. And then somebody else would need another page, or I might need another page. And so that's how we did our work. We did not use not having the proper tools and the proper books as an excuse for not learning. We knew that our teachers expected us to read and get the work done. And so we went out of our way to make sure that sometimes we would do it on the phone if we could do it after school, walk into a neighbor's house, someone who was in our class, we would do it that way, but we made sure we did it. I also tell a library story in the book. There was the Carnegie Library was the Black library, and we were not able to go to the big Bull Street Library downtown, but our teachers would make assignments for books that we needed, either doing research or reading the book, bringing the book home and reading it. And so we would get on the bus and go to the Carnegie Library and ask for the book, or get it out of the card catalog first, I guess. Back in the day, we had those physical card catalogs. And the librarian would say, well, we don't have that book here, but we can get it for you from the Bull Street Library, the white library. And so then we would have to go home without the book and then go back the next weekend to pick up the book that was then sent over from the white library. So it's not that we didn't have access to books, we just didn't have the books in the library that we could go into. And so our teachers had to plan for this. They had to know that it would take a week or so for us to get a book. And so they had to plan to give us enough time to do the work, to read the book, to bring the book home and then do the assignment. And then we'd have to take the book back to the Black library, the Carnegie Library, and then it would be sent back over to the big library on Bull Street downtown. So those are some of the experiences we had. Of course, we had separate places of worship. We shopped downtown on Broughton Street, which is was the main commercial thoroughfare. In some cases, we could not try on clothes in the store. We could not try on shoes or hats because the people who owned the stores or ran the stores knew that if their white customers suspected that a Black person had tried it on before, that they couldn't sell that item. And so we were not able to try it on. So those are some of the experiences. That's not to say that I didn't have a wonderful childhood. You know, we lived in a neighborhood that was a mixture of people who graduated from college and people who barely made it out of high school in the same household. People who, teachers mostly, because women, the job for women, professional job was teaching and nursing. And so we would have those professions in the household. And then sometimes people would be wearing uniforms because they literally were, I don't know, sweeping the floors somewhere or driving a truck or things like that. But it was a cohesive community where everybody looked out for all the children, and we cared for each other.
It's really amazing how, with everything stacked against you, like legally, through the government itself, able to come together as a community and, as you said, still have a good, happy childhood in spite of all of that. That's really quite inspiring. So when did you know that you wanted to be a journalist?
Oh, that's a great question. In 11th grade, I took my first journalism class in high school. My journalism teacher, a woman named Mrs. Law, was not able to have a professional career. She probably never even set foot in a professional newsroom, a daily newspaper newsroom. She taught us journalism from a book. And the class also was responsible for putting out the newspaper, the school newspaper, which a lot of high schools don't even have. I don't expect them to have newspapers, probably more online, but they don't even teach journalism anymore in high school in a lot of places. But we were very fortunate that that was a class that was offered. And so at the end of 11th grade, Mrs. Law called me aside and asked me to consider being the editor-in-chief of the newspaper in my senior year, which meant I would have had to take journalism 2, the second class. And I accepted that offer. She said she saw leadership in me. She noticed that a lot of my classmates would come to me for ideas, story ideas. They would come to me to ask about sources, that is, who are some of the people we should interview for the story that they were working on. And she saw that leadership in me, and so she made that assignment. And so I decided in 11th grade, that was as good as anything. I love to read. I always loved to write. And I realized very early on that I was a leader. Even before journalism, I was a leader. And so I told my family at the end of 11th grade that I was going to go into journalism. My grandmother did not, she lived next door to us, but she happened to be in the house the day that I announced that I was going to be a journalist. And she said something like, remember, this is 1960, I don't know, 66 or so. She said, well, Wanda, I don't know. I don't think I've ever seen any colored girls working at a daily newspaper. So she didn't really have high hopes for that because she thought that the deck would be stacked against me. And she urged me to at least take some education courses, if not major in education, but I didn't do either. I majored in English. I didn't even major in journalism.
Yeah, I think you could bring a good point that a lot of high schools don't teach journalism. I certainly, as far as I remember, didn't have any journalism specific classes when I was in high school. So to kind of piggyback off that last question, what does journalism mean to you? What do you think of if someone asked you to define journalism to you? How would you describe it to them?
Well, the technical term is that journalism is the gathering and dissemination of news and information. That is, we gather the information, we do the interviews, we do the research, we do the writing, and then we edit it, and then we disseminate it. We put it out there, whether it's in print or digital, online journalism, or television, or radio today, podcasting, social media. That is a definition of journalism: the gathering and dissemination of news and information. And so journalism really can start in your neighborhood. It can start at that level even. You can go up and down your block and find great stories to tell. You can find stories that need to be told. Does somebody need a better water system in the community? Are the schools teaching the kinds of in the way that are helping, the ways that will help students to be successful? Are there people who need, especially these days with the challenges that we're facing, are people in need of food or jobs? What are the things that people need to just, to have a good existence in life? And so gathering that information and figuring out how to disseminate it are the big challenges of journalism. I mean, it's so much deeper than that, but that's just the very basic definition of journalism. It's curiosity. It's, people who are journalists have to be curious naturally. We have to know we have to feel comfortable talking to people and asking questions. You know, you hear people say, well, can I ask a dumb question? There are no dumb questions in journalism, because we want to get all the details. We may not use them all when we tell the story, but we need to know them all. So we have to educate ourselves first so that we can educate our audience.
We had someone drop a question into the chat, so I'm going to jump over to that one. It kind of ties back to the first point about growing up in Savannah. It's from Richard. He says that he first learned about Savannah as a slave drop-off, and he was wondering if you'd visited any of that, and what sort of education or how did that affect your background, I guess, or your upbringing. He said he also watched a show, and he believed that it was on Tybee Island and a group of people that lived there, and that they were all a very tight-knit group of people and still hang on to the old ways. And he was just mentioning that. So we'll do that first question first, is, I guess, talking about Savannah as a sort of a hub of transcontinental slavery, and how that sort of affected your upbringing when you were growing up during a segregated era.
Well, I can say for sure that it did not affect my upbringing at all. We never talked about slavery in my family. We never talked, and black parents didn't talk about slavery. It was a very difficult topic. I think we were trying to get past it, and they were trying to raise us as children to say, don't let that define you. What you need to do is get a good education, figure out what you want to do in life, and make us proud. Get the best education that we can possibly afford to get for you. Coming back to Savannah years after I graduated from college to visit family, and then eventually I moved back here in 2013 after being gone for 45 years or so. I learned more about slavery after I left Savannah than I did while I was in Savannah. There are two tours in Savannah from the Black perspective. One of them is more from an Afrocentric perspective, and the other one is more from a civil rights perspective. And so we now learn about the slave market. We learn about the cotton, the place where people bought and sold cotton, the cotton exchange it's called, which is now, I think, the Chamber of Commerce building, grand old building, with the columns and the big steps going up. But we really didn't dwell on slavery a whole lot. As for the culture, there are some pockets of the community that resemble the culture of, I guess, the descendants of slaves. One of them, oh my gosh, I can't remember the name. It's a little community where you're all familiar with Clarence Thomas, who's the Supreme Court Justice. There's a little community that has preserved its heritage in that little neighborhood. It was an oyster community. That is, they would bring the oysters there, and they put together, it's a Black community. They had a process for shucking the oysters and cleaning them and packaging them and selling them. And that's how they made their money. And they're still preserving that culture. The culture of the Geechee Gullah culture is still prevalent in Savannah. In terms of the language, the dialect, some people still speak with the Geechee Gullah community. That's called, it's really a descendants of the Low Country, and the Low Country is everywhere from Savannah to Charleston, I think. And so it's Georgia and South Carolina. So that culture is still there. And there are festivals that happen every year to celebrate, well, not this year, of course, because of COVID, but there are festivals that generally celebrate the Geechee Gullah culture every year. So people are studying it and learning about it and celebrating it, but it really wasn't something that defined me personally growing up.
Excellent. So
the next question was about Tybee Island. Can I just say something about Tybee Island?
Absolutely.
Tybee Island is what was called Savannah Beach at the time, and it is an island off the coast of Savannah. So I live now, I think, 17 miles from my front door to the ocean, which is pretty cool. However, on Tybee Island, we were not allowed to go on the island. It was illegal during Jim Crow years for Black people to go on Tybee Island. It was a resort area reserved for white people. The only people that I ever knew who legally went on Tybee Island who were Black were the people I used to call the shrimp ladies. And the shrimp ladies were the women who were paid to get on a bus, the shape of a school bus, but the buses were painted white. And those buses would come into the Black community and pick up the shrimp ladies. And you could tell the shrimp ladies because they wore white uniforms and white caps, just to keep their hair out of the food, I guess. And they would get on the bus. In years later, I feel like it was more like a prison bus. Not that they were getting paid, probably not a lot. They were getting paid, but it just felt like they could get on that bus and they could only go to the place where they worked on Tybee Island, and then they would get back on the bus and come back to Savannah. So it was illegal. Right after I came to Savannah, moved back to Savannah in 2013, I was asked by Savannah Magazine to write a piece about Tybee Island and the history of Tybee Island as far as the African American community was concerned. And so I did a little research and learned, a bit about it. But our parents always told us as teenagers, do not go to Tybee Island. Once we started driving, they said, do not go to Tybee Island. You will get arrested. You will get in trouble because you're not supposed to be there. We could go to Hilton Head Island. There were 2 Black beaches on Hilton Head Island, and we could go to beaches in Florida and in Jekyll Island, Georgia, but we could not go to Savannah Beach. And so what did I do on my prom night? I went to Tybee Island with my date and another couple. And the other young man, my date owned the car, his family owned the car. And so he drove out to Tybee. We got out there, it was pitch black. They didn't even have lights out there at night, I guess. It was my first time there and probably the last time until I was in my 50s. And on the way back, the other young man drove us back to Savannah. And on the way back, we got stopped by the police and they arrested him. So that's my Tybee Island story.
Just for going onto the island.
Yes.
I guess to try to transition a bit back, to you, what qualities make for good journalists?
Well, there are basic, there are skills and there are qualities. Curiosity is number one in terms of just the kind of personality one may have. Being an outgoing person is always good. I started as an editor, have always been an editor, because I was not always an outgoing person. I was very shy. I was scared to death because growing up in the Deep South in Jim Crow years, I was not comfortable being around white people, and white people were the people who were in newsrooms. And so being comfortable culturally to blend in with other kinds of people, no matter what your own personal background is a very important quality of a journalist, because you find yourself on any given day doing something different every day and talking to different people in different walks of life, whether that's, you could do a health story one day and the next day you might do a story about the weather. I mean, so you're talking to different people. You're also writing for different people. So being curious, of course, being able to write and to get great critical thinking skills, very important. I cannot overstate how important critical thinking is. To get a bunch of information and figure out what to do with it takes critical thinking. What do you use? What do you not use? What's important to the people in your community? What's not important to the people in your community? What's been said before and what needs to be said, what needs to be followed up on the next day and the day after that and the day after that. So those are some of the basic skills that one would need to be a good journalist. And then you get into some of the technical aspects, especially these days, because journalism is so much more technical than it was when I entered the field. When you think about the technology of online, social media, and video. And so now we have to do more than just be able to write. We have to know how to operate a camera. We have to know how to use the cell phone 100 different ways, not just to take pictures and take video, but to edit it, to do social media. A lot of it is technology. So those are some of the being comfortable with technology. We as journalism educators can teach the technology, but people have to be very comfortable in learning the technology.
Yeah, that's something every single day, something new technological pops up that I'm gonna ask our IT guy about. Mm-hmm. So you've worked in several well-regarded newspapers. I think you said 7. Throughout your career.
Newspapers, yes.
Yes. You've worked at the Washington Post, the USA Today, Atlanta Journal, Miami Herald. How are these different cities and different newspapers similar, different? Are they were you able to kind of go from one to the other fairly easily? Did they require different sorts of, I guess when I think of newspapers, it kind of seems like a really broad term, and I see a newspaper and I go, that's a newspaper. I guess I don't really think about necessarily the behind the scenes of how they're made, and each city would have their own sort of requirements for getting the news.
Yeah.
And so I was just curious about going from so many different cities, so many different cultures, and trying to, to hit the ground running and getting going. I was just curious about how it was working in so many different locations.
I think the technical aspect of newspapers during the years I worked at newspapers was about the same. You had to learn the same skills as an editor. I had to know how to edit. I had to know how to write headlines. I had to have good, what we call news judgment, and know what's news and what's not news, what's important today that may not be important tomorrow. I had to learn how to lay out pages, design pages, crop pictures, make sure that the accuracy is very important, very, very, very important. And so those things didn't change a whole lot. What did change is the community. You're absolutely right. Every community has a different culture. And I don't just mean, I'm not even talking about racially. Communities are cultural places. My first newsroom newspaper was in Providence, Rhode Island. I worked there twice. I would work there as an intern in the summer before my senior year in college. And then I went back after I graduated, worked there for 2 years. Providence was an industrial community. They manufactured lots of things. They manufactured watches and toys and luggage and screws. There was literally a place called the American Screw Factory right down the street from where my apartment was. And so I had not grown up in kind of an industrialized community. Savannah was not that. And the other thing culturally is the international culture. There a lot of Italians were in Providence, a lot of Portuguese community, different languages were being spoken, not just in the community, but in the newsroom. And I didn't speak Portuguese, I didn't speak Italian. I really need to, because everybody spoke English, but you would still hear these languages. Even understanding food was different. I love Portuguese sweetbread. I have a friend who worked in Providence until he retired. He would always, if he knew he was going to see me somewhere at some journalism conferences, he would always bring me Portuguese sweetbread because I acquired a taste for it. Probably ate a little bit too much bread, but I really loved that. So the communities were very different, but the newspapers weren't all that different. I think the biggest difference in the newspapers, of course, resources makes a big difference when you work at a paper like the Atlanta Journal versus the Washington Post, where you have maybe 1,000 journalists in one newsroom. You have a lot more resources and you can do a lot more in-depth journalism than you can in a smaller community like in Greenville, South Carolina, where I was managing editor after I left USA Today. But also there's something called style, writing style, editing style. We use the Associated Press style, and when I started, we even had a United Press International, UPI style. So we had to learn both of those styles. And style is, how do you spell words in certain kinds of stories, sports stories, for example? How do you do punctuation? How do you, how do you designate a new paragraph is needed for a new thought? The length of paragraphs, the length of sentences. And you can tell style. I could look at an Associated Press story that came from the Associated Press blindly without any designation. I can tell you that it was written by an Associated Press reporter. I could look at a New York Times story and tell you that it was a story that appeared in the New York Times. The Washington Post had its own style book, and so I had to learn style just for the Washington Post. But primarily I used AP style, and I still know AP style very well. Then I became an author, and I had to learn Chicago style. So style is something that's intrinsic with media, and they're still using style in any kind of printed, and I mean online as well as print, magazines, newspapers, and online is what I would call the print media. So those are the biggest differences: the communities themselves, the culture of the community, and the style of the newspapers.
Interesting. Did you have a favorite that you worked at or lived in? I promise not to tell the other ones.
Well, my favorite newspaper was USA Today. I went from the Washington Post, very traditional newspaper, very gray, that is, no color. USA Today was brand new. I went to USA Today 3.5 years after it started, so it was still kind of new. It's now 38 years old. And I know this because it was USA Today was founded almost the day my daughter was born. So I keep up with the age of USA Today by my daughter's age. I loved working at USA Today. I was young, still, fairly young still. I was in my 40s. And I loved working at a place where we never said, well, we do that because we've always done it that way. You know, we could come up with just wild ideas about how to cover a story, about the kinds of stories, the kinds of topics we would cover. And nobody can say we don't do that because we've never done it before. We always tried new things. We tried new technology. USA Today was, a lot of young people don't know this. I'm sure you do, but a lot of young people don't know that there were no color pictures in newspapers before USA Today in 1982. There were no there were short stories, but most of the stories were very long in newspapers before 1982. There were no newspapers that had more than one editorial position on a single day before USA Today. Now USA Today sort of patented this thing where they would give both sides of a story editorially. They would have the USA Today editorial, and they would every day, and I think they still do, invite someone else to come in and give the opposite view of that editorial and dare to call it an editorial. So there were so many new things about USA Today, and that's why I loved it so much. My favorite city was the Greenville, South Carolina paper, the Greenville News. Greenville is very much like Savannah in terms of its size, very progressive city. It's in the upstate of South Carolina. When I was asked to go there by the Gannett Company, which owns USA Today, I didn't know where it was. I had grown up very close to South Carolina, but on the coast, and the Greenville, I had to go to a map and find Greenville on the map to see where I was going. Very close to Asheville, North Carolina, very close to the mountains, just beautiful, physically beautiful. And it's a place that has a lot of international headquarters, manufacturing headquarters. So it's a very international city, and a lot of people there who didn't grow up in Greenville. And I felt comfortable there because I didn't grow up in Greenville. And so I was not in a community where you sort of had to fit in based on who your people were, or where you went to school, or where you go to church, and that kind of thing. So those are the two favorites, USA Today and Greenville, South Carolina.
Okay. There's a couple more here. What sort of advice would you give to a young person who is perhaps interested in journalism or considering pursuing a career in the field?
Well, I work with young people all the time, and I think, back when I was recruiting for newspapers, maybe until Montgomery, we would always tell young people, figure out exactly what you want to do and go directly to that, and don't veer off and do something different. If you want to be a sports reporter, be a sports reporter. Be the best darn sports reporter you can. If you want to be a copy editor, just figure out how to be a good copy editor. If you want to be a photographer, just do photography so well. And you don't have to learn how to write, other than writing your captions. Now everybody does everything. So I would tell young people to be prepared for a very multifaceted career where you have to know a lot of different skills and be prepared to use all of them every day. In broadcasting, for example, the entry-level reporters are called MMJs, multimedia journalists, and they really mean that. You are going to have we started calling them backpack journalists, and that meant we would send them out at the beginning of the day, and they would have all their tools in the backpack. They would have their cameras and their tripods and their reporters' notebooks and some pens and a tape recorder or two, a still camera, a video camera, just a myriad of stuff. Now, as I said earlier, just about everything that they had in their backpack is right here in their cell phone, but they still carry professional cameras. But be prepared to do a little bit of everything. You will take pictures, you will write, you will do video, you will edit video, you will become a sound technician, because all those jobs have gone away. You used to see a crew show up to cover a story, and there would be a sound person, a video person, a producer, a reporter, and maybe sometimes if it was a big network, I would call him a kind of a lackey, you know, somebody to go get coffee or things like that. Now, one person does everything. I remember sitting on the beach a couple of years ago. I was sitting on the pier at Tybee Island, and just sitting, I think I was just sitting there with either my daughter or my husband or somebody, just enjoying some ice cream. And I looked across the way, and a young reporter was standing on the pier, and she showed up. And I could tell she was a reporter because she carried a backpack, but she had on high heel shoes and a business suit on the beach. And so I was like, okay, that's a reporter. I know that's a reporter. And she emptied her bag and her backpack, and she set up her tripod, and she set up her camera, and then she'd look behind, then she'd stand in front of the camera, and she'd do her light check, and then she'd get behind the lens, and she'd check, and then she'd move it over a little bit, and then she'd do her stand up, and she'd pull out her notebook, and she'd start writing her script. And I mean, she was doing everything. And I thought, oh, that's where journalism it brought us to now. One person does everything.
All right, one final question for you. And I feel like since we're doing this through a library, I feel a little bit obligated to ask it. What sort of books do you like to read? And have you read anything particularly excellent lately?
Oh, wow. Well, you know, because I was writing a memoir for a little over 3 years, I read almost 40 books while I was writing. Now, I happen to be a fan, and you know, don't hate, of ebooks. I'm not ebooks, I'm sorry, audiobooks, because I can get a lot of reading done by driving and listening to books. I walk my dog twice a day and listen to books. I can eat dinner while I'm listening to a book. I can just I shop in the grocery store. I've always got my wireless earphones in. So I listen to Audible and some other audiobooks. So while I was writing my book, I read a lot of memoirs because I wanted to understand, you know, having been a journalist for all those years and writing in a newspaper and editing in a newspaper was very different writing a nonfiction narrative. And so I had to learn how to do that. And I learned how to do that by reading other memoirs, not for their stories, because obviously my story is my story, but I had to learn what is the process and also what is the structure of a memoir. How do you tell a story? How do you tell multiple stories? How do you transition from one story to another? And so I read those memoirs for that reason. I also read a lot of slave narratives while I was writing my book, or getting ready to write my book, because I felt that in order for me to tell my story from the perspective of Jim Crow, I needed to know what the mindset was of people before Reconstruction, during slavery, to enslave a class of people, a race of people, and what those slaves, how they endured slavery. I had to understand that. How did people endure slavery? Because I learned that if from what I know about how people endured slavery, it was easy to endure Jim Crow. So what if somebody didn't want me to try on a pair of shoes or a hat in their store? My ancestors had no shoes. They had no new clothes. They had torn and tattered clothes. They experienced beatings, whereas somebody might have told me that I couldn't sit at the front of the bus. They had no way of transportation other than their feet, walking miles and miles and miles and miles every day. So I read slave narratives for that reason. I wanted to understand that some of them were true stories, some of them were fictionalized historical fiction. So those are the kinds of books. The last book I completed, I'm reading a John Grisham mystery right now, so I don't know if that counts. I love John Grisham. Love it. But the last book I completed is not a new book. It was Disintegration. It's a book by Eugene Robinson, who was one of my colleagues at the Washington Post. He's still a columnist at the Washington Post. He's on MSNBC all the time. And someone recently told me about disintegration as a way of understanding the current situation we're in with conversations about race. I think his book is something like 2010 or something like that. So it's a 10-year-old book. As a result of the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and some of the racist things that have happened in the news in the last few years, I'm being called upon to have conversations about race with a lot of organizations, churches and corporations, not just about my book, but to lead conversations about race, which is a very, very important. I take that very seriously. Leading those conversations, I think it's really important for people to have those conversations. And so I'm now trying to do some more research about race and about integration and disintegration. So I really enjoyed that book. I enjoyed a book by Bakari Sellers, My American Country, I think is the name of the book. So those are some of the things that I enjoy reading.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for joining us today and having a very interesting conversation. And the book is called Coming Full Circle, From Jim Crow to Journalism. It's available now. We have a copy.
Can I share some news I have?
Absolutely.
So I'm working on another book. It's coming out at the end of this month. It is an anthology of essays by African-American women. It literally got started a few days after George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. And my friend, my college roommate, freshman year college roommate, who is also an author, Tina Makara Ansa, and I were having a phone conversation. And she just called me she lives in St. Simon's Island, Georgia, about 80 miles south of here. So we don't see each other very much, but we talk all the time. And she called and said, "How are you doing?" And I said, "I'm not doing so well. I'm just really depressed and I'm frustrated and I'm angry. I'm sitting here watching too much television, too much news with all the protests. And then there was the violence that happened after the protests, which we learned later was not necessarily connected. And then there was COVID, my book tour got canceled, my physical book tour got canceled. And so I was trying to regroup and do it. And I have done it on virtually. And I said, I'm just not doing well. And so we started talking about, well, what can we do? What, as writers, can we do? I shared with her that some of my white friends, well-intentioned white friends, were calling me or emailing saying, "Oh my gosh, I didn't realize that the racial unrest and the discrimination, that the racism in this country is as deep as you have been telling us all these years, because now we see how deep this goes." And so Tina and I decided to do a book together. And we wanted to do something that comes out in 2020 because this is the year of the unrest. And so it's called Meeting at the Table, African-American Women Write on Race, Culture, and Community. Comes out November 30th. And we're really excited. It's 15 essays by 15 amazing African-American women. Some of them are people you've heard of, and some of them you don't know, but you'll read their stories. One of them is the Keisha Lance Bottoms, the mayor of Atlanta, has written an essay. We have a woman who is the first African-American bishop of the AME Church, first woman bishop of the AME Church. They're just, some of them are professors, some of them are just ordinary people. We have the mother of a Wiz Khalifa, who I wasn't familiar with. He's you know who that is? I didn't know. I had to ask my daughter. He's what do you call it? Hip hop or rap? I don't know. One of those, popular music. Anyway, so we write about raising our children in a racist society. We write about having careers in a racist society, and how do you overcome that? How do you bring your family along? How do you have communication with other people in your community? So that's coming out, Meeting at the Table, in November. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So everyone, go check out both of those books. We have a copy of Coming Full Circle here at Florence Lauderdale Public Library. I have it now, but when I'm done with it, it'll be back on the shelves, and you can check that out and check out our new book coming out at the end of the month. And thank you again very much for joining us. It's been a very good conversation. I'm very happy to have you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.